somewhere in here the slides will catch up with me. So welcome everybody. I'm Edith Harbaugh, and I'm here today to talk about when feature flags go bad. And I have some very lovely slides that only I can see. So I'll start with introducing myself. I'm CEO and co-founder of LaunchDarkly. We are a feature management platform. So I've traveled basically all over the world talking to different people using feature flags. What I'm going to talk about today, though, is not a pitch for our product. I think your life will be easier if you use our product, but you don't have to use our product to use feature flags. They're a software technique that's completely separate from us. So more about me and how I got into feature flags is I started off as an engineer back when we did yearly releases. So how many people remember doing a yearly release? How many people remember releases longer than a year? I mean, so this is kind of the old way of doing software is you used to plan out everything for about 2 to 3 months. You would frantically code for about 4 to 5 months, and then you'd have 3 months of QA. And then you'd have kind of this release where you crossed your fingers and double-crossed them and hoped everything went okay. Those days are kind of dead because those days are dying. And I know that those days are not dead yet, but those are dying because if you're doing that sort of release schedule, around you the rest of the world is changing. I went up to Microsoft in Seattle in May, and even they had originally done 3-year releases. And what happens when you do a 3-year release is halfway through it, and if you're lucky it's only halfway through it, the world starts changing around you. So you've thought of everything that you should build, you've started to build it, you're going on this track down to release, and all of a sudden a new browser comes out. A customer wants something else. This cool phone that you thought you would work with suddenly is obsolete, there's another phone. So this is why releases are going faster and faster. After I was an engineer for a while, I kind of got sick of building stuff that nobody wanted. I thought that I was a pretty good release engineer and I'd built a lot of things, but sometimes when we released them, nobody cared. This was incredibly painful, especially if you spent a lot of time on something. So then I became a product manager because I figured I was smarter than my product manager. Product manager is a really hard job. Like, I don't know how many in here are, I'm guessing most people in here are developers, given that it's a developer conference, but product management is also a really challenging job because you're trying to figure out what to build. After that, I was tired of building stuff that I'd talked to customers and they liked it, but nobody knew about it. So I went into marketing. So this was kind of the final stage of, let's build the right thing, let's make sure that people will actually use it, and let's make sure they know about it. From all this experience, I got really intrigued by feature flags. So how many people currently use feature flags? How many people are thinking about using feature flags? Yeah. So feature flags to me were really great from all angles of being a product manager, an engineer, and a marketer. So a feature flag at its most basic level allows you to turn on and off little chunks of functionality. And that sounds really deceptively simple until you start to think about some of the use cases that you could do, which are on these beautiful slides that you can't see. So the most basic use of a feature flag, which is really powerful, is a kill switch. Releases can be really stressful, particularly if you're getting every release is stressful in its own way because you're basically releasing code. And no matter how much you've tested something in a staging or dev environment, as I've tested my slides many times, once you get to the real world, stuff inevitably breaks. You know, the thing that you thought was going to go perfectly suddenly doesn't work. So a feature flag really gives you the benefit of a kill switch, first of all. So separate from deploying a new release, you could turn off a feature. One of the worst experiences I had back when I was engineering was we'd done a release where we actually destroyed customers' data. So this was worse than a bug. This was when you installed it, it would go in and start deleting files. This does sound kind of minor. No, it does. It sounds really horrible until you realize that our customers were the major newspapers of the world. So we had some pretty furious newspapers calling us up saying, like, literally, what the hell? So we very hurriedly did a fix pack, which we thought fixed the issue. If you've ever done a fix pack in a hurry, the chances that it fixed the issue are high. The chances that it breaks something else are also very high. So we did a fix pack A through H. Because we were just kind of in this panic state where you don't really have time to test something. So you're like, but something's really wrong. So let's just hurry up and get this. And the more you panic, the more you get into a bad state. If we'd had feature flags, what could we have done? We could have just said, OK, this is a bad release. Stop. That's it. And then we could have, at our leisure, had the time to go back and retest and figure out what we were doing and not break each other things. So I love kill switches, first of all, because they just give you a lot of peace of mind. Every time you put some, as I said before, every time you put code out, there's this mix of fear and delight. And delight because it's really exciting to see something that you've built suddenly out in the world, and fear because something you've built is suddenly out in the world. So kill switches are a really great use of feature flags. So controlled rollouts are another really good way to use feature flags. How many people here already are using controlled rollouts? Cool. So we use controlled rollouts at LaunchDarkly for things like we'll do a % rollout if something is that has a high system load. One of the best stories I heard from a customer was they were testing a new microservice, and every day they would try to turn it up a little bit more, except for they looked at logs every day around noon, suddenly the usage went down to 0. And they asked the engineer, why does it go down to 0 at lunch? And he said, well, I'm at lunch. If something goes wrong, I want to be able to enjoy my lunch. Well, I mean, it makes perfect sense. It's like so eventually, so he would turn up to 30 and then go get lunch, and then after lunch turn up to 40. Because why get paged when you're on lunch? When you think about this, but this makes a lot of sense. So controlled rollouts are a really good way to wave across a population, and you can get pretty sophisticated in terms of not just an overall percentage of population, but you can, for example, say 10% of people in New Zealand, or 50% of people coming from a certain IP address. And it's a good way to test scale. Another thing that you could do with feature flags, which is fun, is you could give them early risky features to your best customers. It's somewhat paradoxical, but the people who like your product the most are usually the most forgiving. So I've had customers of LaunchDarkly who will give new features to everybody with above a certain net promoter score. So net promoter score basically means that people really like your product. If somebody is above a 50, which is considered a pretty high net promoter, they get the product first. They say that this actually has made their net promoter score go up even more because if it's a risky new feature, people feel included and they feel like they're getting it first. Something that we ourselves do at LaunchDarkly is we just added more SSO support, and the customers who'd asked for it, we gave it to them first, and they were very helpful in our development cycle so they could get access to it first, we could get feedback from them, and then we could roll it out to everybody else. Awesome. Another way you could use feature flags is to block people. There's a lot of reasons why you might want to block people to an early feature. The most notorious one is the CEO rule. Usually you don't want your CEO to see early code because they're usually pretty picky. And it's kind of like, well, this isn't quite ready yet. It's not ready for feedback. Or you might have other groups within your company where you want to kind of shield them. Yay! So I dark launched my own presentation. Cool. Thank you, everybody, for your patience, by the way. This worked yesterday. All right. Let's see. So these are the beautiful slides you missed. just so I did have them. That's the kill switch, early access, and blocking. So there's a lot of reasons why you might want to block people explicitly. So there's inclusion, which is letting people into an early beta, and then there's exclusion, where there are people who it might be destructive if they get early access. Even within your company, it might be another group where perhaps they're working on another part of the system and you don't want them to be exposed to it yet. Maybe you have somebody who's very picky, like your CEO, who you don't want to see it. And then even external to your company, there's a lot of reasons why you might want to block different people. You might want to block an IP if you know it's a competitor. You might want to block certain domains if you know they're the press. I've heard of people who block everybody from @TechCrunch from seeing new features. And you might want to, a very common thing is if you're in a SaaS world and you're selling to other businesses, you might have some customers who say, I never want new features. At an old company, we called this the Morgan Stanley rule because they never wanted anything new. So basically, they wanted everything to kind of bake for about 6 months to a year before they got it. So we would use block rules to explicitly block them from seeing new features. This is a good way to the flip of using early access is kind of the late access, which is here, which is there's always some laggards out in your population who really don't want new features as opposed to the early adopters who do. So right now I just talked a lot about how awesome feature flags are. And I think feature flags are really a great way to improve your development. Now I'm going to talk about some of the pitfalls of feature flags. And I hope that the takeaway you get is that, one, feature flags are really, really helpful for your development process. They allow you to speed up development because you're showing new features to your new users first. They allow you to reduce risk because you can always turn stuff off. They allow you to get good feedback. However, they could be incredibly destructive and a really bad form of technical debt if you're not careful. So I'm going to talk about bad feature flags I've seen. This was a customer, somebody who did not use Launch Darkly. This is Knight Capital. So how many people have heard of the Knight Capital story? All right, so I'll give a recap for everybody else. So I actually wrote an article for this for InfoQ, which is basically how to lose a lot of money very quickly. What they did is they'd feature flagged some features, and they'd feature flagged them deep in the code, and then not really told anybody. So they had some very stale old feature flags called powder peg, which were still in their code. They did a deployment where they thought they were testing something else and flipped this feature on. What this flag was so that in a staging environment, they could very quickly test high frequency trades. It was not meant to be used in production ever. In the Murphy's Law that you just saw, if something should never be used in production, it's going to get used in production. So what happened was somebody flipped this flag, and very quickly they started doing very high speed trading and lost about $500 million in about 20 minutes. And this is real money. This is real USD. It wasn't a play simulation. This was considered legitimate trades that they could not unwind. It took them about 2 hours to figure out what had happened, because this was an undocumented feature flag that, in theory, should never have been flipped. And by the time they caught it, it was too late. So that's probably the worst case they've ever heard of feature flags gone bad. But I love collecting horror stories. So if anybody has a worse one, come talk to me. So now let me talk about how you can avoid situations like that. All right, ambiguously named flags. So feature flags are a really powerful technique to control code. Make sure that you're treating them as a first-class object and start using a naming convention. A terrible name is something like user option 2. Like if you walk away from that for 5 minutes, even you are going to forget what that thing is. Other bad naming conventions are things that are a negative. for example, on an unused feature. What does that even mean? So make sure that when you're naming the flags, it's something that you understand very well, and not only you, but everybody around you. I really recommend if you start using them heavily, somewhere in your wiki, or just decide that this is the convention that you're going to use. I've seen people who name them after their Jira tickets, which is actually a pretty good one, because if you have a good standard for your Jira tickets, this will cascade over. If you don't have a good standard for your Jira tickets, that's a totally separate issue that I'm not going to touch. This is really important because people across your organization might have access to this flag, and you want to make sure they understand what it does. Because if they don't, they could just flip it. So going back to the powder peg example, nobody really knew what that did. Powder peg, what does that even mean? So when you're using a flag, make sure that everybody knows exactly what it is. This also gets important if you start to use feature flags very heavily. I've talked to people who have hundreds and then thousands of flags. That's when it's really important to have a good naming convention, because otherwise you're just accumulating thousands of flags that you want to be able to quickly know. Again, I like the convention of linking them back to Jira ticket, because even if you have a short name in your code, you can always go look at the full ticket for what this thing actually controls. Overused flags. This is a real sign. So what happened here was that somebody had used the same fuse for both a light switch and an elevator. This is great if you want to turn off the lights. This is not so great if you're in the elevator at that moment. When you're using feature flags, be very careful that you're using them only in places that you understand. If you use a feature flag in two different places, you run a high risk of accidentally toggling the wrong thing on and off. A real world example of this is I heard about a team where they both thought that they owned a flag, and they didn't have a way. They configured their feature flags by doing a full deploy. So a basic way of doing feature flags is to have a config file somewhere that's a text file, and then when you run a release, just manually changing it true to false. This kind of is, to me, not an optimal way to do it, because you miss the real power of feature flags, which is controlling a release separate of deployment. If you're doing it in a config file, this means every time that you want to change it, you have to do a full redeploy. The customer I talked to yesterday, I asked them if it took about a half hour, and they all started laughing when I said that for a redeploy. They're like, try half a day. So if you take a half a day every time you flip a feature flag and you flip it wrong, you're looking at a pretty long lag time, and you're really missing out of the value. So what people who is not a customer and not using LaunchDarkly had done is they'd hard-coded all their feature flags into config files, and they had not documented anywhere really what they did, and both teams thought that they actually owned this feature flag. So when they ran a release, one team would flip it on, the other team would kind of be annoyed and go in and flip it off. And it took them about 2 days of flip, to really track down what had happened. Because the root causes of this were, number one, using config files to feature flag, which is bad. Number two, not really documenting what it did, so people misunderstood it. Number three, not having any sort of audit control or permission over it, so that anybody could flip it. It took them a long time to track it down. So when you use a feature flag, think about who has access to it and why somebody should touch it, and design that in from the very start. Conflicting flags. This goes back to the thing I tried to emphasize at the beginning, which is when you start using a feature flag, think about why you're using it. If you're using it to control a front-end system, make sure that it's scoped to that. If you're using it to control an overall new feature, make sure it's scoped to that. Where you could get into a lot of trouble is, for example, if you have one feature flag that controls a dialog box on the front end, another controls a back-end system that's relying on, and you start flipping these on and off separately, because you'll end up in a very bad case. So this is an American sign. When you look at this, do you have any idea if you could park or not? No. So if you have conflicting flags, what you'll get your system into a state where you might have very odd behavior. The worst case I heard of this, again, not a LaunchDarkly customer, is LinkedIn. LinkedIn uses feature flags very, very heavily. If you've ever looked at LinkedIn, you'll see some kind of new features coming in and out. They have a homebrew system that is kind of legendary for how poorly it's maintained. So what happened one day is somebody accidentally flipped all the flags on. And all the flags were on with some CRUD that had been in their system for, at that point, about 5 or 6 years. So like the UI just started disintegrating because it was trying to load old features which conflicted with new features which conflicted with another newer feature. So when you're using feature flags, think very carefully about exactly what they're scoped to and design your system around that. This is usually one of the biggest traps of feature flags is if you use them heavily, you'll start to have segmented up your code by them. If you have poorly designed code, this can get you into trouble. This isn't to say don't use feature flags. This is to more say if you use them, think carefully about how you're controlling them and how you've architected them into your code. So this is another real-world horror story that I heard from an American company. So they had also used feature flags very heavily, and they had in their UI and their admin console one that was labeled "Do not ever push this." And the reason why they were labeled "Do not ever push this" was that they didn't really know what it did, and they didn't want to pull it out, but they thought they might need it someday. You can see where this is going. So one day, and I heard this from the product manager that worked there, they started getting a flood of support calls. And the support calls bad enough that the CEO, and this is a public company, got phone calls from angry customers. Like, so this is something really bad had happened. What had happened was they were a document management system, and people could no longer upload files. So if you can no longer upload files, your document management, you're basically dead in the water. It took them about 4 hours to figure out what had happened. And what had happened is somebody had pushed the button, and the button was there to temporarily block people from uploading files. So somebody had put this, when you think about it, somebody had put this feature flag in for a very good reason, which was probably they had had issues in the past with people uploading too many files very quickly, which could cause a significant system load. So they'd feature flagged it so that they could temporarily throttle this and shut people off. However, they had left this feature flag in, and what had happened is that nobody really remembered that it was there, and then years later somebody pushed it and nobody could upload a file. So it took about, as I said, about 4 hours of pain to figure this out. And to this day, they don't know who turned it on or off because they don't have an audit trail and they didn't have any permissions. So I asked the product manager, so did you take that out? And they're like, no. They put a bigger "do not push this" button. And as she said, the same thing happened about 3 months later, but it only took them about an hour to track down what had happened. So this is kind of leading me to this, which is leftover flags. Yeah, so this is not my actual fridge, I promise. But this is what your code will look like if you're not diligent about cleaning up flags. If you're using feature flags, the best way to think about it is from the start, why are you using this? What's a good name for it? And even plan from the beginning, how are you going to remove it? A best practice is right when you're putting the feature flag in to also already have the code ready to go to take it out. Basically the theory of wash the dishes before you even eat. If you've built the feature flag and you've used it and now you're trying to figure out how to remove it, it's going to be much harder. Particularly if you've used it in multiple places and you've not been very clean about it. However, if you build it in for the start, you can just, it's a very easy task to pull it out. I loved it, the customer I talked to yesterday, they had a phase in their release process which was, the old way would have been just build, ship. Now they have launch, and then they have a phase after that, which is tidying. And I love that, because the old way is that you launch something and then you walk away. The new way of doing something is that you launch something, and you launch it to certain people with feature flags. So you launch it to maybe your best customers, you launch it to your support team, you launch it to your marketing team first, you get reaction, you iterate, you keep tweaking that piece of code over and over and over until it's finally good enough to go to everybody. And then you tidy the feature flag and remove it as an explicit step. That's the happy path. I've also seen what happens sometimes is a feature doesn't make it. And this sounds really sad until you think about it. Sometimes you build kind of a stub of a feature. I've had customers who say, we did a spike, we started to build something, we got some feedback from customers, it turns out they didn't really want it, so we just killed it then. So this actually saved them several months of work to quickly kill a feature early before they'd invest a lot of time in it. So leftovers are actually good. Not these leftovers, don't eat those. But feature flags can give you the ability to very quickly get customer feedback and then take stuff out if it doesn't work. So tidying phase, I love that phrase. Maybe it's me. But think about a feature flag as something that has a full life cycle from name, architecture, cleanup. Hey, so here if I had to distill everything down to three easy ways to feature flag successfully. Flag carefully. Naming conventions. Naming conventions, not just that you'll remember, but that everybody in the team will understand, are super important. Lockdown access. Think again about who needs to actually ever change this feature flag. If you have it in a config file, this is incredibly dangerous because basically anybody who has write access to that config file can change it. And even more, config files, because they're text, are kind of notorious for typos. So you could very easily make a mistake. Just a simple one like saying YE instead of yes or TRE instead of true could really screw up your code. So lockdown access in terms of who has rights to change what. It could be simple or it could be fancy. I've seen people who are more mature with feature flags. They'll actually have separate write access for DevOps who have access on production and QA who will have access on QA. And then they'll even start to get into customer support will have different access than DevOps. And the reason for this is that you want, for example, a customer success person to be able to turn on and off features if people are complaining about them, but don't want to have them have total system access. So this is actually really powerful if you can start to use feature flags for different groups within your company. And probably the biggest thing that I will reiterate over and over again, clean up your flags. Like when you're done with them, get rid of them. Otherwise, they're kind of a ticking time bomb of technical debt because somebody will eventually flip them when you don't want them flipped. That's not to say that you can't have permanent feature flags. I have seen people use permanent feature flags as basically a subscription management system. If you could accumulate flags into, for example, if you have a gold, a platinum, a silver tier, and then you have 5 features that go into this, you could use feature flags to manage that. However, if you are doing that, be really clear about that. Don't mix and match temporary flags and permanent flags. Make it really obvious which ones are things that are part of a bigger subscription plan and not a temporary release flag. Just be careful. So where is this all going? I guess once you started using feature flags, what's kind of next? And I'll talk about the coolest customer examples I've seen. Feature flags really allow you to treat your code as a living object. When you think about it, if you have branches of code, that's basically kind of waste. Because you have code that's being worked on that nobody can see, and as soon as you've branched, you're starting to accumulate a clock of technical debt. because around you, everybody else is checking in their code in other branches, and eventually you're going to have to re-merge. So the shorter branches you have, actually the quicker you can get to market. The quicker you can show something to somebody, the quicker you can get feedback, the quicker you can decide, is this something worth keeping or ditching? So if you're using feature flags effectively, what you're really doing is you're reducing waste. You're allowing yourself to get really quick cycles to market. And this is really cool. Like so everybody laughed at the beginning. They said, well, your releases aren't dead yet. I think it's so much more fun and so much more powerful to work on something where every day you're delivering value to customers versus once a year. So you just get that many more chances to really deliver value to your customers, that many more chances to figure out that, hey, this thing we're working on, maybe it's not the best idea. And that frees you up to go work on this thing over here, which actually is a much better idea. So feature flags, in summary, can be very dangerous if misused, are really powerful if used correctly. So I really encourage you to walk away here with a couple horror stories and think carefully about feature flagging, but also with the bigger takeaway of, this could really help your development lifecycle, and not just you as developers, but also the rest of the business. For example, if in the old days, and I was on both sides of this, developers never, as a developer, I was always scared of shipping stuff because if something broke, I would get blamed. And the product manager would say, why can't you ship this yet? I'm like, oh, it's not ready yet. It's not ready yet. It's not ready yet. And so then the product manager would get mad because everything would be late. However, the flip side is if you shipped it and it was broken, you would get yelled at. If you're using feature flags, what you can say is, hey, this is really early access. You, the product manager, gets to pick who gets to early access. And if you're not happy with the quality, just turn it off. So this really short circuits a lot of the destructive loops within development in terms of you give the keys to the product manager and say, you get to choose when you want it. So I left a lot of time because I love talking about feature flags. So do people have questions?
How do you have any recommendations for the best way to deal with segregating things that are essentially going to be permanent flags and temporary flags? Like how do you rationalize about them and communicate about them effectively?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was temporary versus permanent flags. How do you do this? I'll give a brief plug for my own company, Launch Darkly, and we let you label something as temporary and permanent, and we treat them separately in our system. If you're using your own homegrown solution, I would just do the same thing of have it be some sort of flag on the flag. If you really want to do kind of a crude hack, I would say just use a naming convention. Like I've seen people do like temp underscore and perm underscore. If you want to get a little bit more fancy, you'd have to start building that in.
Well, I guess I was thinking more along the lines of, it's like the struggle I have right now is some of like the developers will clearly understand that this is the thing that should not survive as a permanent flag. This is something that should be transient. And the business will say, well, yeah, but we had these other ones that are permanent. Why can't this one just be permanent too? And so I'm having that difficulty of getting the business to understand that some things should not be flags that are permanent. Like this is just a while we're building a thing. You need to really minimize the number of permanent flags we're going to keep around.
Is there a reason they want them to be permanent?
Just honestly, it's in case it's not we have a need for it right now. It's well, if we've already put the flag there, then why don't we just keep it so that we can turn it off in the future if we want to?
Yeah. So that's really tricky. I've heard that from other people. The what if we need this?
You ain't gonna need it.
Yeah. So what I've seen people do, and this really gets more into a process change, is to have a 3-month rule, which is if you haven't had to turn it on or off for 3 months, it just automatically gets pulled. Okay. And the reasoning for this is that you're accumulating debt by having that flag there, because you're creating a path that could at some point get turned on, and you're probably not actively testing it. You're either actively testing it with all the other flags, in which you're incurring a debt to keep that branch up to date, or you're not. and you're incurring a risk that if you ever do turn it off, it might conflict with everything else. So 3 months is usually long enough that people feel okay. I've seen people go a little bit more stringent with like a 3 week, but then people kind of get nervous. But by 3 months have passed, most people have forgotten that thing exists. But that's really a process change of just having been on both sides as an engineer and as a business. I don't think the business sometimes understands the cost of maintaining all these old branches around because they are accumulating just a weight of unit tests that have to be run against them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's good. And putting just a 3-month rule in place.
Yeah, and then the trick is to remember the 3-month rule.
I'll take care of that.
Yeah.
Do you have any strategies around what, it's really nice on a UI and we use feature flagging, it's all great on the UI, but when it comes down to data and migration of data and how do you deal with the flags? Because there's a lot of touch points now where it goes from data to APIs and libraries and then up into the front end. What strategies should you apply when when there's so many touch points for one flag that turns a feature on and off because the data has to come along for the ride?
So that's a good question. Is your question about migration or about whether or not to take data?
Well, it's like, so we added a feature, for example, to add multiple organization support for a customer, for example, see across organizations. And the shape of the data had to change to support that, and the UI had to change. So how do you manage that? Where's the feature line drawn? Is it the data comes first and you test that independently, or how do you turn it on and off? You know what I mean? Like it's a holistic approach, and I just wondered some strategies around.
Yeah,
that happens.
that's tricky. And let me answer in a high level because everybody's data is a little different. Design it in from the beginning, which sounds obvious, but have a higher level. What I've seen other people do is have a higher level feature flag that controls 2 different dependencies. And that way that you can always make sure that both of them are turned on or off at the same time. I've also seen people branch at different levels where they'll have a UI that's capable of handling both sorts of data and then flipping that within it. These are pretty high level strategies though. Yeah.
So when you mentioned scoping about the feature flags, has there been any best practice emerged around having, so talking about say web tier, API tier, database if you like. So is there like a best practice you would use a single feature flag or scoping to do a tier or like any comments?
It is so dependent on a given company's architecture. It's hard to give a generic answer. It really depends on how you've built your own underlying architecture. I've seen people get very granular at a feature level where every JIRA is essentially a new feature flag, and that's. I see eyebrows being raised. Yeah, I've seen this. And that's very independent of the actual tiers and more at a feature level. I have seen also people do it at every microservice gets its own feature flag, but it's really dependent on more how your own system is architected and what works for you. So, more questions? I love questions.
You talk a bit about how you use this, I guess, our software, most of our customers run it on-prem, so it's not interfacing integrated before. Yeah, so how, is this something you just build yourself then, or can you still use feature services?
So the question is, what about on-prem? It depends how on-prem your on-prem is. Like, do you have any sort of remote access to it?
Well, sometimes it's like using RSA.
I'm sorry?
Like sometimes if that our remote access might be from like Citrix, RSA keys, all that kind of stuff.
So, yeah, feature flags are really a technique that's best when you have some sort of SaaS access. I've seen people do it on-prem if they at least have like a daily way to go in and update things, but that's really starting to degrade then the use of feature flags because you don't have the ability to configure stuff so quickly. I mean, the way I think about it is feature flags are very useful if you're in more of a cloud model And then they're basically, the way I think about it is they're a lightweight access control level, where you're basically tuning in and what people have access to. If you're on-prem, that kind of falls apart because people have access without having to go through the cloud. So does that answer your question? Yeah, I'm sorry.
In the case of when you say not to use config files and to do it sort of thing, what happens if you do something where it scales and you scale from 2 servers to 50 and 48 of those servers can't connect and get whatever the feature flag is? Do you set them all to false, or do you have something in your config file that says this is the default state? Because otherwise you're going to end up at a point where you scale and your service may not be in a consistent sort of featured toggle manner.
Yeah, I should have said that up front, and let me, I'll do that next time I give this talk. Always make sure you have a default. Just as a best practice, always have a known good state of a default so that if for whatever reason you can't read what it should be, there's something to fall back on. More questions?
What do you tend to do from a testing perspective in terms of combination of flags and things like that? How do people normally deal with that?
The question is, what about testing? That's a great question. I've seen people do everything from very lightweight and just assume that prod is where they'll catch everything.
So frame.
Well, to running every combination automated in some sort of staging or dev. I'll say having tested thoroughly and staging and missed fatal bugs in production, I usually try to get stuff to production as quickly as possible because that's when you'll always see the stuff that you didn't see before. As for testing combinations, this is why I really emphasize removing them, and I think that's to the gentleman in the back's point of like why you want to get rid of feature flags is because you're adding a weight every time you leave one in there. Because if you're not testing it, as I said before, you're incurring a risk that it might conflict with something newer. Does that answer your question? I think it really depends on how aggressive you want to be in terms of, there's the one side of always test in production versus let's test everything over here.
So how do testers normally react to that? Because this is obviously for devs, this is like, sweet, we can block out our crap and do it properly. But the testers are usually the ones that we ignore. But then they're going to arc up and be really nervous about this generally because of the extra combinations. They'll still want to check everything themselves.
Actually, this is
a cultural issue, right?
Yeah, and it's really fun because so we have had customers now who've been using us for a couple of years, and what you said pretty much summed it up. There's a lot of fear at the beginning, like, oh, so this means everything is going to be crappy in production, and then there's this mind shift of, oh, all the crap is off in production, and we can turn it on for a couple testers and have them test in real life in production, because there's always combinations of data and such that you're just not going to get on a staging or a QA environment. They're just never going to be the real world. So QA, once they kind of get used to it, they love it. Because basically, you turn it on for QA, they run through their tests on production, and then you turn it on for everybody else. And there's never the cycle of, hey, we tested everything in staging, but we missed these 5 critical issues because just we didn't have the right data. So. Go ahead.
Especially the load. Sometimes the load of staging is not as
Yeah. Yeah, the quote I got from my friend at Facebook is you can't replicate Facebook except for on Facebook.
Have you seen much use for programmatic changing feature flags?
Can you give me an example?
Well, I imagine you have several feature flags, you could have different combinations, so testers want to test particular permutations.
Yeah.
Automated?
Yeah, like automated acceptance tests.
Yeah, I've seen people use, so feature flags are a technique, so I've seen people do everything from, they'll manually flip them and then run silk scripts, for example, or they'll have user human acceptance tests. Does that answer your question?
No, what I meant was, I suppose probably your product
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I was answering the generic about just the techniques of feature flags. So our particular product, and again, you don't need to use our product, it just helps. We do have APIs where you can flip on different combinations and programmatically run them. There's a question all the way at the back who's been very patient.
Yes, hi. Can feature flags be effectively used for desktop applications?
So this is a flavor of the on-prem, and my answer is it depends on how much access that desktop app has to something that could control it. So if it's the kind of desktop app where it's capable of talking back to you, yeah, of course. It's just then something that you can toggle. If it's a desktop app that's inside a firewall and no VPN, there's no way to toggle things. So yeah, it just basically depends on how desktop-y or on-prem-y you are. This is great. I love questions.
So I do see on-prem situations where if you have consultants or someone deploying the software, you can have them install it off and start clicking those switches and calling up the developer and saying, yeah, that was total crap. We're turning that off. We need to fix that in the next release.
Yeah.
There's that.
Yeah, that's the manual feature flag.
So while there's that, the stage where you're going through the deployment, customers are trialing out, kicking their tires, there's a bit of leeway and forgiveness there where the beta features can be turned on for a while.
Yeah. Yeah, the real benefit to go back to your testing is that you're giving people the opportunity to use software in a real world, where you'll really, to your on-prem, it's only when you test a feature in real life that you can get real feedback. The painful way I've done in the past is you try to point people at a beta server that nobody ever uses, and it's not maintained, and then people get very confused also. Great.
Have you ever had examples of where using feature flags has actually been over-engineered or being an over-engineered solution for a problem someone was trying to solve?
I think this gets back to the questions about architecture. I think teams need to kind of find the right rhythm of what level to feature flag. If you've never feature flagged ever and you start immediately doing every check-in gets a feature flag, that's going to seem kind of horrific to your team. Usually what happens that I've seen is people will start using them for a couple major releases. Like we had a customer that was doing a major rebrand and they hid that behind a feature flag and they're like, well, this is great. And then they started using them more and more and more. And then they found in their postmortems that every time something had gone bad, they said, well, this could have been fixed easier if we had a feature flag. So then they got in the rhythm of what was the right way to do it.
I imagine it would be easy to get into the over-engineer everything at the beginning with all the talk of APIs, microservices, feature flag, everything, and then you spend 6 months architecting your solution and not get any products out the door.
Yeah, I think the key is, and I think this is true for any development practice, is something that the best practice is the one that works best for your team. So that's why I've tried to give specific advice, but like every team is a little bit different in how they develop. So figure out the rhythm that your team is going to be happy with and use. Like same with naming conventions. I didn't say this is the right way to name things. What the right way to name stuff is stuff that your team remembers and understands, which is different for every team. So you and
So when we are routing the feature flags, for instance, like we are saying like 30% of the population should see this feature and 70% this feature. So is it a good idea like the 30% should always get that feature rather than giving flip-flop? So at the same time, it seems like a good idea to have like a consistent user experience. But on the other hand, it means like they might have those 30% have stuck with something which they might not like.
So the question is, I think you kind of have two separate questions, which is, if you're doing a percentage rollout, should that percentage have a consistent experience? And then the second is, well, what if they don't like that experience? A best practice with a percentage rollout is to have them have the same experience. So usually when you're doing a percentage rollout, you do it based off of some unique ID so that people aren't logging in at different days and getting different states. A separate thing is, well, what if they don't like it? This really depends on whether they have a choice or not. there's some features that it's just like, well, we're switching to a different search engine, or we're switching to this different backend. You don't really have a choice as a user. What I've seen other people do, though, is they do allow users to opt out. So this is a pretty common thing. There'll be a little button on the UI like, don't like this, go back to the old way. This is really, I'd say, more of a business decision. It's like, what more could happen in this talk? It's really a business decision about whether you want people to be able to opt out of new features. The thing about it that's nice for the user is they could say, well, I don't like this, get me the old way. The risk is then you're stuck maintaining that old way for a while, which gets back to our other points about then you suddenly have this old branch that you have to maintain. It's a business decision. I've seen people maintain an old UI for several years, like mail.yahoo. Still lets you switch. You got to think that's starting to get expensive for them, though. Yeah.
I would like to know about your thought about that trend started by this feature flag recently in the last few years. People encouraging using feature flags. Even the impact is come to the process. I have seen some people encouraging going to feature flags rather than feature branches in the source code, or moving to the production tests. Encouraging test production rather than staging or UAT or whatever. I would like to hear from you to see how do you think about this process, specifically about the feature flag, replacing feature branches with feature flags and testing production.
So the question was feature flags versus feature branching, and what do you think? I think I'll say I think in the long term and then the short term. In the short term, I think people, and this is why I give a lot of talks and I love these questions, I think a lot of people are still kind of wrapping their heads around feature flags. I think people here are more sophisticated than most because they're still getting used to it. I think there are still people who it seems incredibly risky to use a feature flag because the answer I heard before was, well, doesn't this mean crap in production? And my answer to that is, well, you always had crap in production. Now you have a chance to turn it off. So I think some people are still just getting used to feature flags and they need to get comfortable. I think eventually we will get to this place, and I actually wrote an article called Kill Your Staging Server, that we will move a lot more rapidly to production, and that feature flags will act then as a control level for who gets access. Like if you can imagine a world where as soon as a developer commits a line of code, it's automatically deployed off and then starts being ramped up. That's really cool. But I think that's scary to a lot of people right now, and I want to encourage people to take like steps that they're comfortable with as an org and get to the place where they're more comfortable with that. And if people want to hang out on branches for a while, that's if they're making code and that's what they're comfortable with and they're productive there, that's a fine way to do it.
Can you talk a bit about how to differentiate feature flags from just configuration?
Yeah, that's a great.
Are they separate or are they gray area?
That's a great question. The question is config versus feature flag. One way I'd try to, and we actually have an article about this on our website, but I think of a config as something that you only want to change at a deploy time, and a feature flag is something that you want to change independent of deployment. So config might be something like a machine variable that you're never gonna, you basically have to redeploy and bounce the server. A feature flag is something that you want to be able to do on the fly. And then the second level of that is a feature flag is something that you want somebody who's perhaps not that developer to be able to control. So that's when you start to have more tooling around it in terms of maybe a product manager should be able to turn this on or off. Maybe a QA manager should be able to turn this on and off. Maybe customer success should be able to turn this on and off. And when you think about the personas of a customer success person or product manager, you really don't want them in your config files. Because there's a lot of stuff in there that could very easily go very bad if you had somebody in there. So that's kind of the line is who's touching it, why are they touching it, how often are they touching it.
Have you seen a good example of how to push like feature flags down to a Spark wide, like single page applications running in their browser, and like the customer may not server-side behavior in a short period, but may not be getting it to the client?
Ooh, I hate to plug our own product, but we have an SDK for that. It's pretty cool.
So like with WebSocket, pushing it down.
Yeah, it's cool. We actually it's really cool. You should just go look at it. Well, it's cool because when you think about it, like they don't ever have to hit refresh, but because we use WebSockets, they can get a new experience very instantly. I know I'm probably either the first thing or last thing before lunch. I really enjoyed this talk. I'm sorry about the slides, but they are all available, and I'm happy to email them to anybody. Just fill out that form. I'm also giving another talk this afternoon, so you get another opportunity to see me. And if you have any feature flag horror stories, success stories, questions, we have a LaunchDarkly booth here. We're happy to answer questions and talk more with you. So thank you.